have already increased by 15% in Chicago wheat board. In that particular week, the prices of wheat, those increased by 50%. Now, in Pakistan, we need to take a decision if in the amidst a shortage of urea, if we are expecting a low than expected yield of wheat, whether we should import now, whether we should import a month later, whether we should put a ban on exports, how to curb our wheat smuggling. Similarly, if the Ukrainian sunflower seeds cannot be supplied to rest of the world, and that would lead to increase of price of soybean and palm oil, what would be Pakistan's stance on it? Whether we should try to hedge it while the prices are still in control, or should we wait? So all these measures, again, repeating it, that they require very strong and solid evidences in trade. They require the capacity to analyze those evidences. They require the capacity to collect data, to synthesize those evidences, and then communication techniques so that those evidences could be presented to the policymakers. I'll conclude with one more comment, and that is amidst this political situation in Pakistan, both the Treasury as well as opposition benches, they need to be supplied with such evidences, because political economy is a reality, while politicizing the economy is fatal for any nation. And I think the type of political saga that one is observing in Pakistan, it is extremely important for institutions like SDPI and partners like FCDO to do their best to somehow converge these political forces to agree on a minimalistic economic agenda. And that minimalistic economic agenda should be use of evidence and making policies and practices according to those evidences, and not to politicize those evidence. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the deliberations of very learned panelists who are here today. And I'll once again thank FCDO for supporting SDPI in SETI project. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abid, for your welcome remarks, where you've highlighted the different issues around the globe currently and how evidence use is very important to tackle all of them. So moving forward, I'd like to invite Mr. Harry, if he could please come in and give his introductory remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and apologies for joining late on my side. Thanks to everyone who's been able to join. I'll give a little bit of background on myself and on the program. So I was responsible for the FCDO funded Strengthening Evidence Use for Development Impact Program, or SETI as we like to call it, during its final period of implementation. And for anyone who doesn't know SETI worked in Pakistan, Ghana and Uganda, aiming to bridge the gap between the supply of data and evidence and its use in decision-making in critical sectors. SETI developed and tested a range of innovative and adaptive approaches to supporting organizations across the 3 countries understand the barriers between evidence generation and its use, as well as connecting users with useful evidence for decision-making. I think a lot worked well, and we're proud of what SETI was able to achieve and to contribute, particularly in supporting decision-making during the peak of the COVID crisis. And in line with the experimental approach that SETI took, the team has captured lots of lessons about what works and what doesn't work to support evidence use. And we're very happy to be able to share some of this learning today. And I hope that, although SETI has unfortunately now closed, those involved in the program and those interested more generally in evidence use in policy making can take forward some of the lessons and some of the innovations from the SETI program. That's it. I'll leave it there and pass over to the panel.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you for letting us know what SETI has been all about and whatever interventions were put forward through it. Before I move on to the presentations, I'd just like to quickly highlight that we're live on Facebook, and I'd appreciate if all the audience can post their questions over there. And I'd request panelists to keep looking at those questions, and perhaps we'll be taking those at the end of the session if there's time, or otherwise I would request the panelists to be answering them in the chat. Secondly, we will be uploading all of this information on Twitter. So I request everyone to please have a look after a day or two, and in case you want to revisit this session and all the interventions that took place in it. Without further ado, I would like to call upon Mr. Ahmed Khaver with his technical presentation. So over to you, Ahmed. You haven't unmuted in case you're speaking, Ahmed.
Yes, just wanted to first share screen. So I hope the screen is visible and you can hear me, Mahnoor?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. So as Harry and Dr. Abid just mentioned, the strengthening the use of evidence for development impact program, we like to call it Seti, so I will be calling it as such throughout my presentation. I had the opportunity to work in the program, and one of the exercises that we conducted was a stakeholder dialogue, or a public-private dialogue as we like to call it. A series of 12 different sessions between the public and private stakeholders post-pandemic to look at what the evidence needs of the government were, and how we could cater to those evidence needs and bring about different stakeholders on a platform. The platform, of course, after COVID-19, we did not have the liberty to meet, and we had to bring in people on online platforms. So all of so 11 of these 12 sessions were conducted online. One of them had to be conducted in person at the Ministry of Planning, Development, and Special Initiatives, essentially working with the NCOC's platform. So just to quickly run you through the objectives of the SETI program, essentially, it was all about increasing the use of evidence in government structures, government processes, to inform decision-making. And to do so, the program sought to work with key demand-side stakeholders and policymakers. This is a quick look at the landscape, or the evidence landscape in the trade policy space. Some of the evidence producers and evidence users you can see, but of course PBS at the top left side continues to lead the way in terms of producing the most quantity of evidence within the space. So let me take you back to the just to put things into perspective, and where this series came from, why it came into being, and what was the need, and what was the context, and what were the situations the country was going through. So by April 2022, right after the pandemic struck, 73% of SMEs in Pakistan had to pause operations. Out of 920 businesses polled, 50% of them reported layoffs. Textile exports faced a 37% decline. Large-scale manufacturing output also faced 23% year-on-year decline. So this was the kind of situation where the government, more specifically the Ministry of Commerce and the Ministry of Industries and Production, the Ministry of Planning and Development, came forward with different topics and different questions under those topics, on which they requested for real-time actionable evidence to work on, and essentially to look at different sectors as well as a post-pandemic recovery. So essentially the whole 12 dialogues were a demand-driven exercise, by which I mean that the sectors, the topics, and so much so as the questions to be asked to the panelists were also driven by the government. Wherever there was need, the government requested SDPI to come in and help or assist them with designing questions. So through that exercise, or during the course of those 12 sessions that we conducted, what were the key takeaways, or what did we learn was that that platform allowed the government to have that quick access to available evidence, because and the evidence essentially was required to shield SMEs during the pandemic from the economic downturn, and essentially the export-oriented firms as well. So one of the essential takeaways was the reduction in barriers to accessing and using evidence that was available out there, but perhaps the access to it was not that quick prior to the stakeholder dialogues. The Ministry of Planning, Development and Special Initiatives then came forward with their own ideas on a post-pandemic recovery and wanted to have a separate discussion around that with different stakeholders. Through that, we see that the government had improved its own capabilities to identify what the evidence needs were. And I'll come back to this in a bit, that how does that come about. During the course of those 12 stakeholder dialogues, we were also able to develop partnerships for evidence use. For instance, with the Ministry of Plan Development and Special Initiatives, there was a subgroup on industry and enterprise, and SDPI was notified as the convener of that subgroup. Moving forward, we now have also been notified as convener of Planning Commission's working group on e-commerce, which is of course an extension of the work that we did under this exercise. The subgroup at the ministry continues, by the way, continues to still meet and deliberate upon different sectors, which goes beyond the Seti program now. So they're still meeting. This is something that has gone beyond Seti, and this is something that is an example of embedded use of evidence. And with SMIDA, there was an MOU signed to extend evidence around post-pandemic recovery, and we were also able to broker linkages between the United Nations ITC office and the Ministry of Commerce on safe trade. Again, there was another request that came from the ministry to provide some discussion or provide some evidence on the evolving protocols of trade under COVID-19. Communication and the packaging of evidence, of course, has a very fundamental importance within the evidence use landscape. So whenever there was this evidence that was conveyed post each dialogue, we used to develop these one-pagers for the government, the relevant ministries and the secretaries. So whenever there was a question or a counter question or some confusion, we were always able to connect the direct stakeholders from the public side to the private side, whoever were part of those specific stakeholder dialogues, so that the communication or direct linkages could be developed that go beyond the timeline and the length of the program. There were also government officials who were given orientation on how to develop, how to construct, and how to moderate these sessions on themselves. And a lot of those officers that were part of this orientation then went on to develop, construct, and make their own panels and moderate those sessions and acquire the evidence that was needed for different sectors and different questions. All of this happens in an environment where there are different enablers. This is not something that you go in and you develop a series of stakeholder dialogue sessions and these things come into play. First of all, it was a demand-driven exercise. So the pivot, or I would say the urgency to engage came from the government post-pandemic. Kind of the ways and look at the policies and strategies that one could co-develop moving forward and trying to wiggle out of the situation we found ourselves during the pandemic. Sustained and long-term engagements. This is something that is prior to the SETI program or prior to the pandemic and goes beyond the program or the pandemic. So this kind of allows you the trust factor or the linkages or the connections with the government and also in the private sphere, where then you can bring people together in a very short span of time, and you know which people to bring in for what topics. So this again is something that goes beyond the scope of the program, but is very fundamental to the program's outcomes. The subgroup on industry and enterprise at the Planning Commission, of course, different contributions to the NCOC were made. Then there was a release of exporters tax, sales tax refunds that was stuck at the FPR, and then we were also able to develop a training module for civil servants within the safe trade protocols. So moving forward, what do we learn and where do we need to go from here, right? This is where we've come, and what does the future look like, or where do we need to move forward now? So in some of the cases, we found that up-to-date evidence, the private sector, in some of the cases and some of the topics, did not have up-to-date evidence. That is something that needs to be looked at, and needs to be looked at where are those deficits and how those deficits could be plugged in. Female participants often found less value in engaging with policymakers. There was this hesitancy, and a lot of times there was this notion that there might be some backlash from different larger associations or larger businesses if female participants came in and spoke about different issues within specific sectors. But again, constant engagement and persuasion, played its role. But of course, there was this hesitancy that was noted. In the evidence use space, there is a need to sensitize the donor community of how this can work for both the government partners and of course also in the private sector. I think there needs to be a sensitization that needs to be brought in. And then what about the public sector or the officers in different governments and ministries and units? We see that there is a need to improve and update curriculum and capacity of the public sector officials so as to make perfect use of evidence for decision making. And I'm sure the next presentation is going to take this point forward and elaborate on this a bit more. So I think I'll stop, and I think I've taken more time than allotted. Mahnoor, back to you.
Thank you, Ahmed, for that presentation. It was quite insightful, and you brought everyone up to pace with whatever activities we conducted under Seti with regards to stakeholder dialogues during COVID-19 and everything. Moving forward, I'd like to invite Dr. Vaqar for his technical presentation. Here, I'd also like to add that not only will he be giving his presentation, but will be taking the discussion forward and engaging with the discussants that are present in our session here. Over to you, Dr. Vaqar.
Thank you, Mahnoor, and thank you, Ahmed, for the presentation. I think this second presentation largely tries to summarize the evidence diagnostic exercise that we had tried to co-conduct with one of the government bodies, which is the National Tariff Commission. And happy to see Hamood Saab here as well, representing the National Tariff Commission. And just to quickly explain that why we sort of embarked on the conducting of these evidence diagnostic studies, or why is it that these evidence diagnostic studies are usually resorted to or conducted. Firstly, these studies are one of the instruments to bridge the gap between political economy analysis and the program implementation. And they really allow us to put into practice what we call thinking and working politically approach. And the approach essentially emphasizes the political insight and analysis, responsiveness to context, and how to remain flexible and adaptive during implementation. And this sort of comparative advantage, which evidence diagnostic provides, comes in very handy when one is trying to pilot from the very wide variety of interventions which may be available to help production and use of evidence. Now, what are the diagnostic involved basically? In case of Pakistan, the diagnostic exercise was carried out by joint teams from Seti program, and we have Rahika here representing Seti and Oxford Policy Management, who were our partners in this program, SDPI, and from the government side was the National Tariff Commission. We, amid COVID times, of course, we had to adapt, but we collaboratively adapted and tailored the diagnostic tool, which is called the Context Matters tool. And what the Context Matters framework allows us is that it allows us to analyze internal structures within a government department, processes in a government department, a culture around evidence, ways of working, including the kind of capacities which may be there to produce and use evidence, and the capacity to perhaps broker relationships for evidence procurement and evidence use. And just to sort of allow you to see the various tiers within the Context Matters framework, the first tier is analyzing the macro environment in which the government department, here, for example, National Tariff Commission, what is the macro context in which the NTC works? The second layer of diagnostic essentially is the intra and interrelationships with, of course, government as well as non-government bodies. And the third layer is about the culture of evidence. And of course, culture can be defined separately, but culture also includes that very important question around whose evidence is regarded as credible in the government. The fourth layer of diagnostic is around organizational capacity. And of course, this includes not only the capabilities at the senior level, but also at the mid-career, junior level, advisory positions that may be allowed for the organization to utilize. The fifth tier is analyzing the management processes within the organization, and how far are they flexible, adaptive, accommodative of change, for example. And lastly, the tier talks about the resources which may be available or which may be required for improving the demand and use of evidence. Now, this is an important slide. This is an important slide given that it explains that the areas within the Context Matter framework which are most relevant. One could really pick those areas and devote energy to those segments where in the shortest possible time with the least possible resources, the impact could be highest for the organization, and the organization is enabled to use data and evidence to inform its policy, inform its decision making, and eventually help improve the outcomes. In this case, of course, trade competitiveness as an outcome. Now, what was delivered under this diagnostic exercise, and my colleague Mahnoor has shared in the chat, she has shared the link to this learning brief as well, which tries to summarize what was delivered. With the help of National Tariff Commission and their team, we identified appropriate entry points, for instance, particular units that would be most strategic to engage in research, in improvements in data, evidence use. Of course, motivation to focus on evidence use and demand also varies across units and teams. So one really needs to bring out those champions who would be there in the system and who could assume the responsibility to handle evidence and bring evidence to use. And at a third level, the teams decided on a set of interventions or intervention toolbox, as we call it. And lastly, informing the design and timing of interventions, which intervention comes first, which would be a prerequisite for the following or later interventions, for example. So this was the sort of sequence in which the diagnostic was delivered to the NTC. And of course, we received very productive comments from National Tariff Commission as well as the leadership at Ministry of Commerce and Pakistan Ministry of Trade and Development. Now, just quickly, in the interest of time, the key learnings which come out in our diagnostic. One, of course, is that trusted working relationships with the government, of course, takes time to cultivate. In our case, we have been extremely fortunate given that we had a working relationship with the NTC, and NTC's leadership was very open to strengthen that relationship, be open to outside ideas, allowing people to study the organization from the outside and deliver advice and what we could co-conduct. The AAA lens was important, and authority, acceptance, and ability, as we call it, AAA. This, of course, AAA lens enabled us to understand the appetite within NTC and to partner with the program and further explore the use of evidence. We, of course, use this lens to analyze other departments as well, particularly Trade Development Authority of Pakistan, TDAP, Federal Board of Revenue, FBR. And this detailed analysis around the AAA lens as used for economic management institutions is provided in another Seti report, which the link to which my colleague Mahnoor has shared, which was the role of evidence in policymaking in Pakistan. The third key learning was that it's important to adopt an approach which combines research and capacity building. Of course, we are fortunate that NTC is an organization which has good internal capabilities to understand these concepts. But bringing in new research and combining it with capacity building gives a sense of achievement, sense of going well beyond the current knowledge endowments, something which was appreciated in a very rapid evaluation that we had conducted. And then fourthly, of course, we were living in pandemic times, and virtual working did facilitate the inclusion of some stakeholders that would have otherwise been unable to join the process, particularly in terms of the public-private dialogues, which my colleague Ahmed Khaver talked about. Many of those many of those private sector stakeholders which were taken on board from far-flung areas of Pakistan, even the diaspora community, they may not have, or their voice may not have featured unless we had allowed things to go online, which somehow happened rather more organically during the diagnostic exercise, and the fact that NTC was very open to be discussed online in a public-private dialogue setting. And many of these sessions, the focus group meetings were in fact live tweeted as well. Finally, what has happened after Seti ended? And this is of course about the question around uptake and sustainability. And we're very, very pleased to see that NTC has taken 2 or 3 steps on its own, which were a key recommendation from the evidence directive which Seti had provided. First is that using own resources, using internal resources, and really utilizing internal teams, NTC has proposed the idea for a center of excellence on tariff and trade policy, which will sort of be an evidence use hub within the NTC. And we are informed that the minister, the advisor on commerce, Mr. Razak Daud, has really liked this idea, and he wants to see the center operational as soon as possible within NTC. More lately, I think a concept note has been approved around this center. Second, NTC has taken own initiative to build in-house capabilities for rapid surveys, rapid market surveys. And at least two of the surveys that we know of would be initiated very soon. One looks at the effectiveness of export facilitation schemes and whether NTC or NTC's measures are helping increase the effectiveness of exporter facilitation schemes. And second, NTC is open to look into effectiveness of its own work for micro, small, and medium enterprises, MSMEs as we call them, and whether NTC's work is helping these MSMEs, or how can NTC's value for MSMEs be increased over time. Lastly, there have been very decent, very strong rather, learning partnerships which were proposed, and NTC has been able to strengthen those partnerships more lately with the World Bank's Trade and Competitiveness Practice. We're also hearing about a collaboration with UNCTAD Geneva office, and this again is something which we feel would go a long way in building capacities and sharing of knowledge, which can in turn strengthen evidence use going forward. There are others, and we really want to hear from them as well. So maybe because I think I was able to sort of include NTC as the key example in the diagnostic, I would want to invite Mr. Hamood or Rauf, but before that, maybe because I do understand that Mr. Naveed Aziz is traveling at the moment, and he's in a meeting with the chairman PND. Maybe I'll request Naveed Saab, who's senior governance advisor at FCDO Pakistan office, to come in first, and then he'll be followed by Mr. Hamood or Rauf from National Tariff Commission. Naveed Saab, over to you, please.
Ji, thank you, Dr. Saab, and my apologies. I'm actually in a moving car, so I can turn my camera on and show that to you as evidence, because we are talking about evidence here. So, and if there is any disruption, again, my apologies in advance. So I'll try to be very brief. I've been closely working with Seti when it was operating, and I also worked with other FCDO programs. And use of evidence is a cross-cutting, recurring theme in I think all of our programs. So I'll just cite a few examples where we have worked very closely with governments, provincial as well as federal, for promoting the use of evidence. And since I was not able to hear what was being said earlier, so my assumption is that these examples are perhaps not familiar. The audience is not familiar with these examples, and Dr. Vaqar, especially, you have not talked about the work that SNG is doing. So a couple examples from SNG, and I think some other sectoral programs will be in order. So my starting point would be that there is no dearth of data in government. It's more about capacitating them to use that data better, to be able to analyze that and use that as a foundation, not only for policy, but also for improving accountability, in the sense that government should be able to know what's happening on ground, and then should be able to either reward or sanction those who are not really performing well. So that is the, I think, theme that we have taken up in several of our programs. Starting with SNG, Sub-National Governance Program, we are working very closely with planning departments in both KP and Punjab. And one area where a lot of emphasis is being laid on is improving government's capacity to appraise PC1s or planning documents that come to them for approval, right? So PND, being the regulatory authority and being the approving authority, needs a lot of capacity building to be able to judge, analyze, and then decide whether these proposals coming from 9 departments are really worth the money that they are asking for. So again, that can only be done if evidence is used in a robust and objective manner. Ideally, this capacity should also be built in departments, but since we are constrained, we are now perhaps focusing more on PND's capacity to do this. The second example that comes to mind immediately is the work that we have done during COVID, and this is again working with provincial authorities to improve their capacity to take decisions during a time of crisis using evidence. We all know about BISP and the Federal SARS program. What we did, that was quite unique in Pakistan's history, especially at the provincial level. Government of Punjab wanted to go one step further. And when it tried to reach out to people, several cases came up where people were judged to be deserving. They certainly fell in the category of those who would qualify for assistance, but their data was missing in National Socioeconomic Registry. So how can you take decisions on the basis of a data set which is 10 or 11 years old? So the first step was to update the database. And this is where we have helped Punjab government to start creating its own socio-economic registry, which will also be shareable with federal government and other governments if they want, because ultimately this is about citizens of Pakistan overall, not just citizens of one particular province. The third example that I would like to share with you is some of the work that we've done under our sectoral programs, i.e. health and education. We all know that health particularly is an area where government underspends. It's just 0.86% of Pakistan's GDP that's spent on health. But what is more important is whatever is being spent, how is that spent actually creating any difference? Because you can keep on spending money on bad projects and that would not lead to any kind of improvement in outcomes which are desirable. So working with both provincial governments, again, KP and Punjab, we instituted a mechanism which placed a lot of emphasis not only on data collection, but also on verification of data and then its use. And a lot of that data is already existing in one system or another. There are so many MIS systems in health department alone. I think we counted them back in 2014 or 15, and these were 15 odd MIS systems operating in health department alone. So it's not that there is paucity or dearth of data. It's about how this is used. So with our help, government was able to, I think, achieve improvements which are perhaps a record in Pakistan's history. So before the intervention started, only 27 out of 2,400 BHUs in Punjab had all 18 critical medicines available. And there was not a single district which had all the BHUs, any BHU which had all the medicines available. So the first order of business was to enable the health department to have that data on a routine or real-time basis. And instead of files moving around, a digital system was set up which enabled top decision makers as well as officials working at the district and sub-district level to see data being collected and verified through an independent mechanism. Long story short, that mechanism enabled government to not only increase availability of critical medicines, but also see whether staff is present or not. Another perennial problem the Pakistani health system faces. And ultimately, I think we are very proud to claim that increased skill birth attendance and increased immunization in provinces like KP and Punjab, we have contributed to that by enabling government to use that data which is already available in the system, but maybe not properly analyzed, packaged, and used. So Dr. Saab, I'll stop here and ready to take any questions, maybe now or later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naveed Saab, for these great examples of how data and evidence is being innovatively used in FCDO supported programs and government departments, and really grateful that you could join, while of course I do understand that you had very pressing commitments. I would now like to turn to Mr. Rauf Saab, who's joining us from during our diagnostic exercise process. Hamood Saab, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Vaqar. I'm sorry I was late in connecting the meeting. I was not able to connect due to some problem with my laptop, so I'm connected with my mobile phone. Maybe there may be some disruptions in it. First of all, thank you for inviting me in this August forum. And I would like to introduce National Tariff Commission for those who do not know about it. National Tariff Commission is an organization working under Ministry of Commerce, advising them on tariffs, tariff matters, and trade remedy laws. We can impose anti-dumping, countervailing, and safeguard duties after a thorough investigation. These are 3 agreements under WTO. And on tariff matters, we advise government on tariffs of different products, and then government can take decision on that. So it was created, the National Tariff Commission was created in 1990, and the purpose was to have evidence-based advice from Tariff Commission regarding changes in tariff, because government at that time didn't have anybody to advise. So our work was collecting information, analyzing it, and then presenting reports to the government of Pakistan. So similar work was assigned to us under anti-dumping, countervailing, and safeguards. We used to collect data from all stakeholders, prepare our report, and submit it to the commission for determinations. So when this 2 years back, when we were told that this diagnostic exercise is being done with the Tariff Commission by SDPI for strengthening evidence for informed decision, at that time, I was a bit confused that why NTC is selected for this purpose, because NTC is already collecting evidence and providing information to the government on evidence. But later during this CD exercise, we realized that many things which we were doing, but we had problems, but we didn't know about that. So it was like a patient and doctor, that doctor diagnoses problems with the patient, and then patient can address the issues with him. So similar thing was done by SDPI, this exercise, and they, after having long meetings with us and collecting information from our colleagues and teams, they gave their findings on relationships with our government departments and about our culture and about process and management. And these detailed information made us to analyze our working and how we can improve this our work and improve the evidence, and having interaction with World Bank, with SDPI, with other departments, so that we can improve our work. So in light of that, and at the end of their findings, we also received recommendations from at the end of this exercise, and on the basis of that, we have reconsidered many of our works. As Vaqar has mentioned, that we submitted a paper making NTC a center of excellence, and we are involved in surveys, and we have also approached World Bank, where we had problem of funds to collect the evidence before pre-budget exercise, because we had to advise Tariff Policy Board on tariffs. Our teams are in consultation with the businesses to collect more evidence and to make informed decision on tariffs and provide more informed advices to the government of Pakistan. Over to you, Vaqar. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamood sir, for this overview, and really happy to see that some of the things, of course, which you had piloted, and they're now, of course, maturing, and of course, ideas around evidence use, further ideas around evidence use have poured in after the diagnostic exercise. So thank you indeed for your interventions. I now want to turn to Ms. Tayaba Batool, and I think Ms. Batool has this, she's in a unique position where she has worked for 2 or 3 institutions of trade governance, including the Ministry of Commerce. She has worked with FBR, which has quite a big role in sort of ensuring trade competitiveness for Pakistan. And I think in both these organizations, she has helped build research capabilities. So it would be good to hear from her, not only her comments on the discussions up until now, but also because she has been a partner and she's participated in various Seti focus group discussions as well. So it would be important to hear her inputs on where we stand today and how are some of our trade governance institutions moving forward. So it's over to Tayaba, please.
Thank you, Dr. Vaqar, for inviting me to speak on this very pertinent topic. And as you have highlighted, as well as Naveed Saab also highlighted, the importance of data and its use to drive decisions to make most effective use of our resources. So use of evidence has been critical in policy making. And this phenomena is not new, but suddenly we see that too much emphasis is being paid on it. So, if we just look at a little in the background, every one of us may recall, or rather I should say most of us will recall the FIFA 2014 semi-final between Brazil and Germany. After the match, a terminology of 12th man was coined. So who was that 12th man? It was the big data. So what happened, that the player's performance was captured using the cameras, spread around the pitch, and millions of data points were produced to track distance traveled, movements, direction, speed, possession time, number of touches. And from all those multiple data points that were gathered, some targets were set. So like one of the target, as we may recall, was to reduce the ball possession time. And we witnessed the results. So they developed a special software, SAP, which was created for that purpose. And we see other softwares now that help us in conducting our analysis. Computing languages and algorithms are being employed for all these purposes. So policymakers in international trade arena are therefore developing innovative tools to help them in making evidence-based decision-making. We may recall the efforts by the University of Sussex in the formulation of its TradeSift software. We have the efforts of UNISCAP, we have the efforts of the overall GTAB community. So we see these different forums and softwares coming in to support us primarily in making the evidence-based decisions. So the very first thing one has to become familiar before delving into gathering data or employing analytics is knowing just what is intended, and we can then accordingly start looking into what is to be answered. So I'll just go over few of the examples that I have jotted down, in fact, from the discussion that was following. For example, Dr. Abid was mentioning about the food sustainability. So UNDP's SDG unit at the Planning Commission, they have conducted this excellent exercise on measuring the food price anomalies through a simple index. It's a very simple index, but it helps them in forecasting the price changes and in terms of looking into the price volatility so as to ensure the food sustainability. Similarly, we look at the value chain analyses and the sectoral exercises that were undertaken by the Ministry of Commerce and NTC to come up with sectors that can actually help Pakistan in diversifying its exports. So we can look into these different examples. The work is on, everyone is putting in a lot of effort to actually make as much use of the evidence as is possible. As Naveed Saab was also highlighting, that there's so much of data available, and we can make real good use of it. Just to quote few examples, like for example, because you want me to actually look into how we can even better make use of this data. So we can look into the, if for example, we have to see the trade policy analysis perspective, then we can look into estimating trade gaps. So we have to see how far how much is the difference between the potential and the actual trade for that matter. So we can employ methodologies for estimating those trade gaps by simply employing some micro simulation model, which will be based on some input output coefficients. NTC is doing a lot of work relating to that. Then we can actually look into the expenditure in terms of the duty foregone due to the concessions given under the FTAs, PTAs, so as to undertake a cost benefit analysis of those FTAs and PTAs. So similarly, we can look into the impact of legislative changes on consumers to simulate an impact that we can also do simply by looking at the, just the growth rates, or we can simulate an extensive modeling exercise. We can, you may recall that we did very extensive exercise at the urban unit with the government of Punjab. That comes to my mind as a very interesting case because we employed multiple data layers like roads, rivers, canals, built up area, railway track, motor tracks, industry, even night light imagery and population land scan, labor, employment. And we actually brought all those layers, different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that we may call it, and we formulated the Punjab spatial strategy so that the resources can be optimally utilized. So we can actually see the benefits of data. We can employ sophisticated techniques like regression-based methods, machine learning, some kind of time series analyses, forecasting, or we can simply employ the simple statistical methods. So we have all the options available on the table, and just depending upon what type of analysis we are intending to undertake, so we can actually make best use out of the given data and evidence. So we can go on and on counting the benefits of data and evidence. However, it is very important to have good data, so we can also obtain meaningful results out of it. So I think I should stop here because this is a subject, or rather one more thing that I would like to add, because specifically we are looking into it from the trade policy analysis perspective. Now, since the ministry is cognizant, all the attached department of the ministry are cognizant of the importance of trade data analyses that PTAD, Pakistan Institute of Trade and Development, has started training all the commerce and trade group at the initial training level, the STP level, as well as at the MC level in the trade data analyses, and the softwares like TradeSafe, and they are also thinking into using advanced softwares as well. So these are the different things that actually now we are all cognizant, and efforts are being made to actually employ as much resources towards this as possible. Thank you, Dr. Saab.
Thank you, Tayaba, for this very comprehensive inputs, and not only covering, of course, MOC and FBR, but also, of course, PTAD as well, and giving us real-life examples of where we stand and where's the potential for greater use of evidence. I do see that there may be some questions in the chat or otherwise which would come your way, but thank you very much. Let me now move to Mr. Umer Bhatti Saab, and given that Umer Saab has also served trade governance in his capacity of being part of Pakistan's mission to WTO. So he has a good comparison of not only Pakistani institutions, but how, for example, multilateral institutions are sort of bringing evidence use tools to aid their decision making. So Umer Saab, it's over to you, please.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Dr. Saab. Assalamu alaikum and hello to everyone. So before coming to the present, I would like to take the audience back to the GATT, when GATT started. So General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. So what was the purpose? The purpose was to, am I audible? Hello? Okay, so
yes,
the purpose,
yes,
so the purpose was to liberalize the trade. So we have to bring down the tariff. There were two motives, primarily through all the rounds of GATT, starting from 1949, 1961, 1973, and then the finally Uruguay round. So there was two purposes basically. So first, we have to bring the tariffs down, and then we have to cut short of the predatory pricing policies, which is called dumping, basically. So we have seen the evidence in that as well, because the tariff in 1947, when the GATT started, the tariff was like around 22%. And when the Uruguay round ended in 1993, the tariff was brought down to 5%. And again, there was evidences that the countries who were earlier following the protectionist regime, they gained from the trade. We have seen the case of the rise of the Asian tigers. What happened in 1995, that everything accumulated, and WTO was established at the 1st January 1995. So Pakistan was already observing the gains from trade, and the evidence that there has been gains from trade. So Pakistan joined the bandwagon of the WTO. It was a founder member of the WTO. But unfortunately, Pakistan was disadvantaged on two fronts. So that we could not produce at that point in time the competitive trade commodity. We could not make advantage of the protectionist era, and we could not beef up our manufacturing industry. And on the second hand, the second disadvantage was that we could not diversify the products which we are going to export, taking advantage of the trade integration or the economic integration provided by the WTO. But again, Pakistan was lucky in a way that two things happened. That WTO went into a deadlock. We all know that after 2006, or even before 2006, the Doha Development Agenda had started, and it is still sort of in a limbo or in a deadlock. So, and the second important thing which happened, luckily for Pakistan, that in 2001, I think 2001 or 2, China basically joined the WTO system, and it was a huge shock basically to the world economy in a way, because it was a huge supply shock because of the relative price advantage of the China. So since Pakistan knew that, since there have been evidence in the past that there have been gains from trade, so Pakistan knew that by bringing down the tariff with China, which is also a neighbor, so we can bring down the tariff with China, we can go further into the deepening of trade with China, and then we can make use of that. So what we did in 2005, we started the negotiations for this free trade agreement with China. Again, that was also because we had prior evidence, and evidence, in the shape of data. So we went into the FTA, and the FTA was, I would say at that point in time, it was hailed, it was successfully welcomed. But then over the years, like 6 or 7 years, after 6 or 7 years, and when I joined the Commerce Ministry in 2012, so people in Commerce Ministry and policy makers in the Commerce Ministry, they started thinking that the products which China really need, Chinese market really need, we don't even have that in our FTA list, the product list. So there was, again, the data became the helping hand. So there was this whole study which was being conducted. That was what I think Ms. Tayaba was referring to when she said that we can use identify the trade gaps through data, and trade gaps were identified in revisioning the free trade agreement with China. And it was revised, and the second phase was launched, I think, in 2013 or 14. So, but still we see that trade is pretty lopsided between Pakistan and China. So there's a huge gap. I think Pakistan is only exporting around $2.5 billion of exports, and China is exporting to Pakistan around $6 billion. So there is still a lot of gap. So I think Pakistan has taken advantage of the evidence-based system pretty much. We also have an FTA with Malaysia. We are going to have an FTA or deepening, I would say, sort of deepening of the trade with ASEAN countries. And I was just reading this morning that International Chamber of Commerce and WTO has launched a toolkit to assist companies and the government's agencies in adopting available standards to accelerate the digitization of trade processes. And how Pakistan can benefit from that. Pakistan first have to, upgrade its infrastructure, and we have already done that. It's not like that we are not doing anything. Obviously, we have done a lot in terms of, and the example is VBOC, the online customs portal. And then now we have just started this Pakistan single window. So I think this toolkit, which WTO and International Chamber of Commerce launched, it along with Pakistani upgraded system, it can help a great way in digitizing trade. And along with that, I think that if we see the trade in terms of Pakistan between its neighbors, so there are many trade routes, for example, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, but all of them are not being utilized because there is not much infrastructure. And when we talk about the trade between Pakistan and India, so that's a totally a different ball game, I would say. That's what Dr. Abid Suleri was saying in the beginning, that is basically the subject of political economy. But again, that should not be politicized, and there must be inroads which should be built and between Pakistan and India. And there is also an evidence for that as well from around the world. But we can see China and Taiwan, sorry. So China and Taiwan, they're basically adversaries. We every day we hear about China is going to take over Taiwan, but still the trade is around $120 billion US, and trade is lopsided in favor of Taiwan. It's a smaller country, so Taiwan is exporting around 80 billion and China is only exporting around 42 billion. So if those countries, I mean, which China consider its own territory, but still the trade is going on. And there have been evidences in 2001 and 2 that when the tensions were at the most, disastrous sort of level between China and Taiwan, the trade even expanded further. So there is an evidence. So Pakistan and India and in the South Asian trade, I think it must go forward, taking examples from the other regions. So that's also an evidence, I would say. So I would stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Umer Saab, and really appreciate these examples. And I do understand that in your capacity at Ministry of Commerce, at WTO, you had a chance to look into some of the experiments around production and use of evidence really closely. So thank you for sharing these insights. Now, I'd request, rather I'd give back to my colleague Mahnoor for picking up some of the questions which have been asked by the audience at Facebook Live and other places where I think our communication is being valid. Before we ask Ms. Rahika Menon and Dr. Abid Suleri for their closing remarks. So over to you, Mahnoor.
Thank you, Dr. Vaqar, and I just want to thank all the discussants. This has been quite an insightful discussion. So there are a couple of questions that have been asked by our participants. Perhaps I could start with asking 3 questions together, and then give our panelists a chance to answer, and then we could take more questions after that as well, if time permits. So firstly, we had a question about the Charter of the Economy and the relevance of it regarding it being a cure for the upcoming crisis to build the Pakistan economy. And also in the trade context, has it been important, or has it been helpful in that, will it be helpful in that aspect? So secondly, we have a question about evidence use post-pandemic. So, government's urgency for evidence use during the pandemic was seen altogether. But can this be sustained post-pandemic, or was it just due to COVID-19 that the government scrambled for answers? That is the second question. Thirdly, we have another question about how government trade-related institutions and authorities are linking up with the private sector to improve evidence gaps related to trade policies. As public-private interaction is the key to strengthen evidence-based decision-making in the trade ecosystem. So one by one, if I could request all panelists to answer, please. Thank you. Perhaps we could start in the order that we had the discussion. If you could go first.
Yeah, so please, Ahmed, I think you wanted to go first, please.
Okay, so thank you, Doctor. Mahnoor, I would like to respond to the second question, where the question was about the urgency of the government to engage during the pandemic, and can it be sustained? Of course, there was this urgency, or the pandemic, of course, forced the government and the private sector's hand in coming together and devising out ways and strategies to move forward. But for instance, just look at one of the examples, the subgroup that was established at the Planning Commission on Industry and Enterprise. It was created during the stakeholder dialogue series, and perhaps at the height of the first wave of the pandemic. It has sustained itself and continues to regularly hold meetings on different around different sectors, and continues to feed the Minister of Planning on different forums and on different sectors and problems. And that's one. The second point is that the engagement or the evidence that the private stakeholders bring in, and how sensitizes the government around that. And I think I would like to link this to the second question, that yes, the pandemic broke the barriers, or broke that reluctance or hesitancy within the government circles and the private circles to come together and join. It provided that impetus to first come together, develop those partnerships, and develop that important trust. So that's what the pandemic did. It gave us platforms, it gave us that trust, but that trust is, so far at least, I can say that it is being sustained on different forums. As Hamood Rauf Sahab also mentioned, that we are now moving forward collectively with NTC, going to a couple of surveys, if my memory serves me right, and we are continuing the engagement that we started 2 years back. So yes, in my estimation, yes, these efforts are being sustained.
Thank you, Ahmed. G, Dr. Vaqar.
Maybe I'll let Tayaba and Umer Sahab probably also respond to the question around whether government was interested more on the evidence question, on the evidence issue, because it was the pandemic and everyone was scrambling for answers, and will that interest in greater use of evidence remain after the pandemic as well? I'll let both of them answer this, but what I can do is that I can sort of try to address the first question, which was around the Charter of Economy, which in my personal opinion was not and is not a bad idea. there should be, as Dr. Suleri also said, some consensus across party lines on the minimal economic reform agenda. However, it is easier said than done because economics, trade, all of them remain political subjects. And of course, due to the political nature of economics as a discipline, the differences of opinion are bound to take place. So it's difficult for political parties to really sit around a charter of economy. And this is something which has been our experience. And we have seen this since 2013-14, the first time when this term was actually coined by the then party in power. But on pandemic and evidence, maybe I'll let Tayaba and Umer Saab respond.
Thank you, Dr. Vaqar. Yes, I think that this use of evidence, extensive use of evidence rather, that was happening under COVID, I think this is going to, the momentum is going to continue. And even previously, I think BISP, since its inception, is a very big example in front of us how evidence has been actually employed for the best interest in terms of the poverty alleviation. And you may recall our work at the cabinet division when there were 2010 floods. So, you know, we were able to launch Watan card just because of the extensive evidence that the government has with it and how effectively it was able to make use of it. I would also like to add to this second question, which is relating to how the government trade-related institutions and authorities are linking up with the private sector to improve evidence gaps related to trade policies, as public-private interaction is the key to strengthen evidence-based decision-making in trade ecosystem. Ahmed has rightly pointed that COVID has bridged the gap. However, I would like to add that the government has been interacting with the private sector for each and every policy intervention that it has been introducing since long time. And I'm sure Umer will also add more to it because, you know, even at every step while the trade policy is being formulated or at every step when for example, you know, in the past some time we were having a lot of negotiations with Afghanistan going on. So, you know, would interact with the private sector extensively. And as Umer gave the example of China, so at each step in the phase 1 of the Pak-China FTA, as well as in the second phase as well, the private sector has been extensively engaged so that not just the evidence that the government has gathered itself, we make best use of that, as well as we want the private sector to bring in their industry evidence that they have, because we primarily use at the ministry the trade data. The missing link that we still face to date is linking that trade data with the industry data so that, you know, we can come out with even more meaningful conclusions. So that is one area where we have to engage, and even more extensive engagements with the private sector may be made in the future so that, you know, we can do or use the evidence even more meaningfully.
Umer Saab, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I would like to say something first about this private sector and the government linkage thing. Dr. Saab, if you would remember, I think last time Abid, you were here when we were Fahim Sardar Saab was here. We were doing a webinar as well, and we talked about these SMEs spread across Pakistan. So there are like, I think 5 million of them, or but no one knows that where do they exist actually, and there is not even a single list any Pakistan Chamber of Commerce have, or any of the government institutions have. So we have to first come up with a concrete list of all those SMEs. And so SME is a separate thing, and there are like 4.7 million trader. I remember Fahim Sardar Sahab was pointed out that as well. So we have to have a database of those as well. And then secondly, we are already undergoing a study, doing a study with SDPI that how we are collecting the information or the pre-budget proposals from across Pakistan through various Chamber of Commerce and Industries. And then after their compilation, we are going to hand it over to the government or the Ministry of Finance for the consideration in the upcoming budget. So yes, obviously, private sector and the government sector, they have to be involved. Otherwise, the recommendations coming from the private sector, they cannot be incorporated into the policy making. That's a very given thing. About that COVID, about the data thing, I think as I already said, we, especially in the Ministry of Commerce, we were already in a position, we were already gathering data, we were already working on that more and more. And since we are going to have this economic integration with ASEAN or with ECOWAS, I would say the East African community, I think, the community of West African nations. So I think that's a given as well, that data is very much necessary. But after this COVID, because it has become a household thing, the data, and after COVID, so we can collect a lot of other information when we are talking about COVID and other variables. So yes, I think this trend should go on, and this will go on now. So that's what I have to say. I think I'm not that privy to this COVID data thing. I'm sorry with that.
No issues, but you've done justice to both questions that have been asked. Just want to quickly thank all panelists for participating here. Last but not least, I'd like to invite Ms. Rahika Menon for concluding remarks and a vote of thanks. So over to you, Ms. Rahika.
Thank you so much. This was a very, very interesting discussion, and I think a sort of fitting conclusion to Seti's activities in Pakistan. When Seti started in 2019, I think we had very different ideas on how we should be working with government. I still remember those initial workshops. And then the pandemic hit and everything was thrown out of the window. And we had to go back to the drawing board. But like they say, in every crisis, there's an opportunity. And I think I'm really grateful to all our partners for rising to the challenge. So first of all, a big thanks to our government partners for showing the faith in us and for showing the sustained interest in using evidence to inform decision making. And I don't think we would have made any headway without that faith. Also, I'm really grateful for all of the work that SDPI has done. It's been amazing work, playing multiple roles, that of an evidence broker. There was so much to do during crisis situation, looking at global evidence, looking at local evidence. There's so much of uncertainty, bringing in the voices of different stakeholders. So it takes a special talent to be able to sort of synthesize evidence, start making sense of the evidence, thinking about what makes sense for action. Supporting our government partners in evidence-informed curriculum, supporting our government partners in bringing change within the organization. And I think there's, in such a short time, I think there was so much achieved, and the instances of the various use of the use of evidence, as well as the work that continues to go on, shows that there's value in doing things like this. And finally, I'd like to thank FCDO for supporting such a program. Seti was a very unique program. It was adaptive, it was demand-driven. It was not one of those programs that's just pushing out the evidence, but actually encouraging us to listen to decision makers, to listen to their problems, and then figure out what solutions could be used. So I'm really grateful for the funding for this program. So thank you very, very much, everyone.
Thank you, Radhika. It certainly was a pleasure working with you as well. Before ending the session, I'd like to call upon Dr. Vaqar Ahmed to...
Thank you. I think I would thank...
Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mahnoor. I think I would like to join you in thanking Radhika, particularly because we received quite a bit of help, quite a lot of hand in sort of improving the quality of output in Seti, of course, through her very continuous effort. Claire Hutchings led the program from Oxford. Also would like to thank her and bring her contribution on record as well. Lastly, I think because this program is being recorded and will be available at the SDPI's YouTube channel. So it's important to mention that all of the resources which have been cited, mentioned, or pasted by Mahnoor in the web links in the chat box today, they can be accessed via Google or via the websites of Oxford Policy Management, SDPI, and INASP, who were the three partners in this diagnostic exercise. We must also thank our esteemed colleague from the National Tariff Commission, Mr. Mohammad Hamood Rauf Saab, and of course, a chairperson, Ms. Rubina Athar Saiba, whose guidance and advice remained with us throughout the diagnostic exercise. And of course, I must also thank Mr. Umer Bhatti Saab and Ms. Tayaba Batool for their interventions today. Harry and Mr. Naveed Aziz have played a role in structuring this very discussion today. They commented, they provided inputs for structuring the webinar meeting today, for which I'm thankful to both Harry and Naveed Saab. And of course, last but not the least, I would like to thank my own team at SDPI, including Mahnoor, Ahmed, Aisha, Ilyas, and of course their respective teams as well, who have contributed to this project. So let me thank the panelists and the audience, and I'm sure that in the coming days, we'll find an opportunity to do a follow-up and track our own progress of how far we have gone in terms of uptake and sustainability of some of the ideas which have been discussed today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, SDPI.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ji.
Thank you, everyone.